"You're just a janitor. Get out of my hangar." The words were not shouted. They were dropped. Dropped from a great height, like stones into a still pond, designed to make a splash that would ripple outward and humiliate everyone in its radius. They landed in the cavernous silence of Hangar 7, a place so clean you could eat off the floor I had just polished. The air, thick with the scent of atomized jet fuel and ozone, seemed to hold the insult, letting it hang there for everyone to inspect. I did not move. My hands, calloused and sure, remained steady on the worn wooden handle of the push broom. I did not look at her. I did not flinch. I did not offer a defense, because the truest things require no defense. I simply stood my ground, a fixed point in her rapidly accelerating world. My stillness was my answer. There were 3 hours and 12 minutes between that moment and the moment her $90 million world was brought to a dead stop. 3 hours that would prove that some men are measured not by the job they are seen doing, but by the knowledge they choose to hold in silence. To understand what happened in those 3 hours, you have to understand the nature of metal, and to understand that, you have to understand my father. My world was not always the sterile, cathedral-like expanse of a private executive jet hangar. I was raised in a different kind of temple, one made of corrugated tin and smelling of grease, sweat, and burning welding rods. My father, Samuel Thorne, was a master aircraft mechanic, an artist who worked in steel and aluminum alloy. He never owned a plane, but he knew their souls. He could lay a hand on a fuselage and feel the stress in its rivets. He could listen to an engine spool up and diagnose a faulty bearing from 300 yards away. He was a metal whisperer. His hands were his testament. They were a roadmap of scars, burns, and busted knuckles, each one a story of a problem solved, a crisis averted. He taught me that every machine has a voice, a language. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. "Listen to the metal, Marcus," he would say, his voice a low rumble over the scream of a turbine engine being tested. "It sings when it's happy, it groans when it's tired, but when it's about to break, it whispers. You have to learn to hear the whisper." For 15 years, I did just that, not in a civilian garage, but in the disciplined, high-stakes world of the United States Air Force. As a master sergeant, my domain was the flight line, my congregation, the massive C-5 Galaxies, and the untouchable F-22 Raptors. I wasn't a pilot, a hero slicing through the clouds. I was the man on the ground who made sure he could. My name was the last one in the logbook before a multi-million-dollar asset and a human life were launched into the sky. It was a responsibility I carried in the marrow of my bones. I lived by checklists, tolerances, and the unwavering truth of physics. There was no room for ego, no space for error. There was only the standard. When my wife Sarah passed, that world no longer fit. The long deployments, the unpredictable hours, the constant state of readiness. It was no life for a single father trying to raise a 7-year-old girl. My daughter Maya needed a father who was present, not just a hero in a faraway place. So I made a choice. I traded my flight suit for a set of gray coveralls. I traded the roar of afterburners for the quiet hum of a floor polisher. I walked away from it all, honorably discharged, with a box of medals and a pension that wasn't quite enough. The job as a night shift janitor at the Blackwood Executive Air Terminal was perfect. The pay was steady. The hours were predictable. I was home every morning to make Maya breakfast. I was there to pick her up from school. I could attend her recitals and help with her homework. No one here knew who I used to be. I was just Marcus, the quiet man who kept the hangar floors immaculate. It was a peaceful anonymity, a self-imposed exile. In my pocket, I carried my father's micrometer, a vintage Starrett caliper he'd given me on my 18th birthday. Its steel was cool and heavy, a tangible link to him, to the man I was, and to the standards I still upheld, even if only for myself. It was a reminder that the work of your hands defines you, not the name on your uniform. The jet was a Gulfstream G700, fresh from the factory. Her owner had christened her the Albatross. It was a pearlescent white, a predator built for the stratosphere, sitting under the sodium lights of the hangar like a museum piece. Its price tag was $92 million. I knew this because the ground crew, a group of kids barely out of their teens, spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. They washed and polished its skin with a tenderness they probably didn't afford their own girlfriends. I was sweeping the perimeter near the portside wing, the rhythmic shush-shush of my broom, a familiar, meditative sound in the vast quiet. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a noise. It was a frequency, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible whine that vibrated in the bones of my inner ear. It was the kind of sound that 99% of people would never notice, and the 1% who did would dismiss as faulty lighting or their own tinnitus. But I knew that sound. It was the whisper. It was the sound of a system under a pressure it was not designed to hold. My father's voice echoed in my head. Listen to the metal. I stopped sweeping. I stood perfectly still, closing my eyes, tilting my head, letting my ears do the work my eyes could not. The sound was constant, a thin needle of noise piercing the low hum of the hangar's climate control. It was coming from the port engine's housing, near the wing root where the hydraulic lines were most dense. I walked closer, my soft-soled boots making no sound on the concrete. I knelt down, pretending to tie my laces. My eyes scanned the floor. The concrete was polished to a mirror finish, a flawless gray canvas, and there, almost invisible against the reflection of the overhead lights, was the sign. A single, tiny bead of fluid. No bigger than the head of a pin. To anyone else, it was just a drop of condensation, a speck of oil. But I knew the telltale iridescent sheen. It was Skydrol, aviation hydraulic fluid, nasty, corrosive stuff, and it had no business being outside the sealed system of a brand new aircraft. I followed the drop's gaze upward, tracing an invisible line to the belly of the wing. I couldn't see the source, not from this angle, but I didn't need to. A bead of Skydrol on the ground meant there was a leak. A leak combined with that high-frequency whine meant it was an active, high-pressure leak. A high-pressure leak on a primary flight control actuator was not just a problem. It was a potential catastrophe waiting for altitude and air pressure to turn it into a reality. A cold certainty settled in my gut. That plane was not safe to fly. My first thought was of my daughter, Maya, of the promise I made to her mother that I would always be there. My second thought was of the nameless, faceless people who would be on that plane, blissfully unaware, trusting their lives to the machine and the men who maintained it. My responsibility, the one I had carried for 15 years in the Air Force, clicked back into place like the action of a well-oiled rifle. The gray janitor's uniform I wore felt suddenly thin, a costume that no longer fit. I had to say something. I stood up and looked for someone in charge. The chief pilot, a man in his late 50s named Henderson, with a crisp white shirt and an air of harried importance, was barking orders at the young ground crew. He was a man who looked like he was more concerned with his client's timetable than with technical details. Still, he was the pilot. He was the final authority. Protocol dictated I go to him. I approached him cautiously, keeping my hands visible, my posture non-threatening. "Excuse me, Captain," I said, my voice low and even. He turned, his eyes flicking over my uniform with instant dismissal. "What is it? We're on a tight schedule." "Sir, I was just sweeping under the port wing. I believe I saw a small hydraulic fluid leak. You might want to have your maintenance crew take a look before you button her up." I kept it simple, factual, unemotional. Henderson didn't even glance toward the wing, a smirk played on his lips. "A leak? Son, this is a $90 million factory-new Gulfstream, not a '78 Buick. It's got more sensors than a hospital. If there was a leak, the cockpit would be lit up like a Christmas tree." He gestured dismissively. "We have a world-class maintenance team that costs more per hour than you make in a month. I think they've got it covered. Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned his back on me, a clear and final rejection. The kids on the ground crew had stopped their work to watch the exchange. I saw the look in their eyes, a mixture of pity for me and fear of Henderson. One of them, a young man named Leo, whom I'd shared a coffee with in the break room once, looked particularly uncomfortable. He was a good kid, earnest and eager to learn. I walked over to him as he polished the fuselage. "Leo," I said softly. He jumped, startled. "Oh, hey, Marcus. Sorry about him. The client is a real piece of work, so everyone's on edge." "It's not about him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to me. When they did the pre-flight check, did they run a full pressure test on the #1 hydraulic system all the way to 3,000 psi? Leo's eyes widened. He clearly had no idea what I was talking about, but the specificity of the question registered. I don't know, man. I just fuel and polish. The mechanics do all that stuff. Why?" Before he could answer, Henderson's voice boomed across the hangar. "Leo, are you getting paid to chat or to work? Get that bird ready to go." Leo shot me an apologetic look and scurried away. The door was closed. I had followed the initial chain of command and been rebuffed. I had tried to go through a secondary channel and been blocked. The tug was already moving into position to tow the G700 out to the tarmac. The flight was scheduled to depart for Zurich in less than an hour. A long, transatlantic flight over the cold, dark ocean. I could see it in my mind's eye, the slow, steady loss of hydraulic pressure at 40,000 feet, the failure of the aileron controls, the slow, unrecoverable roll. I could walk away. I could go back to my cart, finish my shift, and go home to my daughter. No one would ever know I had seen anything. It would be a tragic accident, a mystery for the NTSB to solve. But I would know. I would have to live with the silence for the rest of my life. My father's words came back to me again, not a memory this time, but a command. Listen to the metal. I had listened. Now I had to act. The owner of the jet, the source of all the tension in the hangar, was a woman named Evelyn Reed. I knew her only by reputation, a tech CEO famous for her aggressive business tactics and a public persona that was equal parts inspiring and terrifying. She arrived in a black Escalade that drove right up to the jet, a privilege afforded to very few. She stepped out, flanked by 2 assistants who scurried around her like pilot fish on a shark. She was tall, dressed in a severe black pantsuit, her face set in a mask of impatient power. She was not a person you approached. She was a person you avoided. I watched as her luggage was loaded. I watched as the flight crew stood at attention, their smiles tight and professional. I watched as the final preparations were made, the ground power unit disconnected, the chocks pulled from the wheels. It was now or never. I left my broom leaning against a support column, and I began to walk. I moved with a purpose that turned heads. The janitor, who was normally an invisible part of the hangar's ecosystem, was suddenly walking a direct line toward the client. I crossed the invisible line that separates the help from the masters. I planted myself at the bottom of the air stairs, blocking her path. Captain Henderson saw me first. His face went from professional calm to panicked fury in a heartbeat. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away from the aircraft." I ignored him. My eyes were on Evelyn Reed. She stopped on the 3rd step, looking down at me as if I were a piece of trash someone had forgotten to sweep up. Her assistants froze. The entire hangar held its breath. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I work here. I strongly and respectfully advise you do not take off in this aircraft." A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, quickly replaced by amused contempt. "You advise me?" "Yes, ma'am. I have reason to believe there is a critical hydraulic failure pending in the port side aileron actuator. It is not safe to fly." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was sharp and brittle, a weapon in itself. She looked past me, at Henderson, then at her assistants, sharing the joke with her court. She looked back down at me, her smile vanishing, replaced by a cold, flat deadness in her eyes. "I have a 9-figure merger to close in Zurich tomorrow morning," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "My time is worth more than this entire airport. I am not taking aviation advice from the man who mops the floors." She took a step down, until her face was inches from mine, and then she delivered the line, "You're just a janitor. Get out of my hangar." A security guard, a gentle older man named Frank, who usually just sat at the gate, came rushing over, flustered. He put a hand on my arm. "Come on, Marcus. Let's not cause any trouble." I didn't resist. I allowed Frank to lead me away. I could feel every eye in the hangar on my back. I heard her say to Henderson, "Get him fired. I don't want to see his face here again." I heard the air stair door close with a final, sealing hiss. The humiliation was absolute. It was public, and it was complete. I was no one, a ghost in gray coveralls. But a ghost can still make a phone call. I walked away from the scene, not with anger, but with a chilling sense of clarity. The situation had been simplified. I had tried the path of quiet conversation. I had tried the path of direct warning. Both had failed. The system of personality, ego, and hierarchy had rejected the truth. So now, I had to use a different system. A system that did not care about uniforms, job titles, or net worth. A system that cared only about physics and federal regulations. I went to the employee break room at the back of the hangar. It smelled of burnt coffee and microwave popcorn. On the wall was a corkboard with union notices and a yellowed list of emergency numbers. Airport operations, fire department, security. I ignored them all. I reached into my wallet, into a hidden flap behind my driver's license, where I kept things from my old life. I pulled out a small, heavily worn business card. It had no name on it, just a seal of a federal agency and a single phone number for a direct line. A number I knew by heart. I picked up the greasy receiver of the landline phone and dialed. It rang twice. A clipped, professional voice answered. Duty office. No name, no agency. They knew whoever was calling was supposed to have the number. "I need to report a potential imminent failure on a civilian aircraft," I said. My voice was different now. The quiet janitor was gone. The Air Force Master Sergeant was speaking. "Your authorization code?" the voice asked. "Ghost wrench. Authorization 749er. It was a call sign I hadn't used in years, a designation for anonymous, high-level maintenance reporting within the military. It was still active in certain databases. There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Authorization confirmed. Go ahead. Gulfstream G700. Tail number November 700 Echo Romeo. Currently at Blackwood Executive, Hangar 7. Scheduled for immediate departure. I have observed a high-frequency acoustic anomaly and evidence of a pinhole leak of Skydrol hydraulic fluid at the primary actuator assembly for the portside aileron." I was specific. I used the language of a report, the language of certainty. "Can you confirm the component part number?" the voice asked. "A test. Should be Parker Hannafin, part number 7A-429B2, I said without hesitation. "Advise immediate grounding and a level 3 non-destructive inspection of the component. Suspect hairline stress fracture on the main piston housing. Catastrophic failure is likely above 20,000 feet due to pressure and temperature changes." Another pause, longer this time. The man on the other end was no fool. He knew this level of detail wasn't coming from a disgruntled baggage handler. This was a professional assessment. "Understood, Ghost Wrench. The nearest field inspector is 10 minutes out. We're issuing a mandatory grounding order effective immediately. It will be transmitted to the tower and the aircraft itself. They will not be cleared for takeoff." "Thank you," I said. "Stay safe," the voice replied, and the line went dead. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. I took a deep breath. The die was cast. I walked out of the break room and back into the main hangar. The massive hangar doors were rolling open, revealing the dark tarmac and the glittering lights of the runway beyond. The G700, the Albatross, was already being towed out, its navigation lights blinking. A beautiful, perfect machine that was also a ticking time bomb. I picked up my broom and began to sweep, melting back into the background, becoming invisible once more. The tug had just disconnected from the G700's nose gear. The jet stood alone on the tarmac, its two massive Rolls-Royce engines beginning to spool up with a low, hungry whine. Inside, I knew Evelyn Reed would be settling into her plush leather seat, sipping champagne, her mind already in Zurich. Captain Henderson would be going through his final pre-taxi checklist, the janitor already a forgotten annoyance. Then, at the edge of the airfield, a new set of lights appeared. Not the familiar blue of airport security, but the distinct, flashing red and white of a government vehicle. A black sedan with federal plates drove directly onto the tarmac, ignoring all standard protocols, and parked at an angle that blocked the jet's path to the taxiway. It was an undeniable, aggressive assertion of authority. A man in a simple dark suit stepped out. He wasn't armed. He wasn't flanked by guards. He didn't need to be. He carried an authority that was older and more powerful than any CEO's wealth. He was from the Federal Aviation Administration. He walked with a calm, unhurried stride directly toward the cockpit. He held up a hand, and the ground crew, who had been about to give the all-clear signal, froze in place. Through the cockpit windows, I could see Captain Henderson's confused and then horrified expression. The jet's engines, which had been climbing toward their taxi thrust, spooled back down with a mournful sigh. The air stair door, which had been so finally sealed, opened again. Evelyn Reed appeared at the top, her face a thundercloud of rage. She stormed down the steps, her high heels clicking angrily on the metal. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the tarmac. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have clearance. My flight plan is filed." The FAA inspector was unmoved. He had the placid, unshakable calm of a man who dealt with furious millionaires for a living. "Yes, Ms. Reed, I know who you are. And I am Inspector David Chen from the FAA. As of 2 minutes ago, your aircraft, November 700 Echo Romeo, is officially grounded. It will not be flying anywhere until my team has conducted a full safety inspection." "On what grounds?" she shot back. "This plane is brand new. It just passed a full workup." "On the grounds of a credible and highly specific safety report we received moments ago," Chen said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. He held up a small tablet. "The report alleges a potential hairline fracture in the primary actuator for the port side aileron, part number 7A429B2. Until we can verify the integrity of that specific component, this aircraft is a potential danger to yourself, your crew, and anyone it might fly over. It is not moving. This is not a negotiation." The pilot, Henderson, had come down the stairs and was standing behind Reed. His face was pale. The specificity of the part number, a detail not even he would know without looking it up in the maintenance logs, had clearly shaken him. The confidence he'd worn like a uniform a few minutes ago had evaporated. "This is insane," Reed sputtered, but her voice had lost its edge. The mention of a specific part number had pierced her armor of wealth and influence. This wasn't a disgruntled employee. This was something else. A report from who? Who would make such an accusation? "The source of the report is confidential," Inspector Chen stated plainly. "But I can tell you this. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were talking about." He turned to Henderson. "Captain, I need your full maintenance crew back here, now. We're opening up that wing." The maintenance team was recalled, grumbling and annoyed, certain it was a wild goose chase, a prank call from a rival corporation. They rolled out their scaffolding and tool chests, their movements slow, resentful. Evelyn Reed stood on the tarmac, her arms crossed, her entire being radiating a furious, impotent impatience. The $90 million jet, her symbol of power and freedom, was now her prison, chained to the ground by a single, anonymous phone call. I watched it all from the shadows of the hangar doorway, leaning on my broom. The wheels of a system far more powerful than any one person's ego were now turning, slowly, but with unstoppable force. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I felt a quiet, solemn satisfaction. The standard was being upheld. That's all that mattered. The maintenance crew worked for nearly an hour under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. Inspector Chen watched over them, a silent, implacable observer. At first, their external visual checks revealed nothing. They ran a systems check from the cockpit. The computers reported green across the board, just as Henderson had predicted. I could see the lead mechanic shrug, giving the inspector a look that said, "I told you so." But Chen was not deterred. "The report specified a hairline fracture," he said, his voice carrying in the now quiet night. It wouldn't show up on a standard pressure sensor. You'll have to use a dye penetrant test. Get the NDT kit. More grumbling. The non-destructive testing kit was brought out. It was a meticulous process. The mechanic carefully cleaned the actuator housing before spraying it with a thin, bright red dye. After a few minutes, he wiped the dye away, leaving a clean metal surface. Then, he sprayed a white developer over the area. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal remained pristine. The lead mechanic was already turning to Chen with a triumphant smirk. And then, it appeared. A tiny, crimson line, like a blood vessel breaking the surface of the white developer. A spiderweb-thin crack, emerging from a bolt housing and zigzagging for less than a half-inch. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, but it was there. It was real. A collective intake of breath seemed to pass through the entire crew. The lead mechanic, his face ashen, leaned in closer with a magnifying glass. He didn't have to say a word. The silence on the tarmac was more damning than any announcement could have been. The whisper I had heard had been given a voice. The tiny bead of skydroll had been its signature. They had found the fracture, exactly where I said it would be. Captain Henderson looked like he was going to be sick. He staggered back, putting a hand on the fuselage to steady himself, staring at the wing as if it had betrayed him. He, more than anyone, understood the physics of what would have happened. The forces on that actuator at 450 knots would have torn it apart. He would have lost all control of the left side of the aircraft, a graveyard spiral over the Atlantic. No survivors, no black box recovery, just another mystery of the sea. Evelyn Reed, who had been watching with impatient fury, now simply stared, her mouth slightly agape. The reality of her own mortality, a concept she had probably never seriously entertained, was now laid bare before her on a piece of flawed metal. She had not been delayed. She had been saved. Saved by someone she had dismissed as less than human. Inspector Chen made a note on his tablet and spoke into his radio. His work was done. The investigation would now be handed over to the engineers. The plane wouldn't fly for weeks, maybe months. The question began to ripple through the assembled crew. Who could have possibly known? No one from the maintenance team had seen it. It was a 1-in-a-million catch, a flaw that likely originated at the factory, invisible to every standard inspection. Leo, the young ground crew kid, was standing near a tool chest, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. I saw him replay the day in his mind, my quiet warning to him, my confrontation with Henderson, my final desperate plea to Reed. He remembered me asking about the hydraulic pressure test. He had seen me walk toward the break room phone just after I was dismissed. He was putting the pieces together. His eyes scanned the controlled chaos on the tarmac, looking for someone. Then he looked back toward the deep shadows of the hangar. He saw me. I hadn't moved. I was still standing there, a janitor at the end of his shift, my work for the night almost done. I was the only person in the entire area who wasn't looking at the crippled $90 million jet. I was looking at him. Our eyes met across the 100 yards of concrete. There was no accusation in his gaze, no shock, just a deep, profound, and overwhelming sense of respect. He had seen both the humiliation and the vindication. He was the witness. He lifted his hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a salute from one professional to another, regardless of the uniform. I held his gaze for a moment. Then, I returned the nod. A single, slight inclination of my head. It was all that was needed. No words were exchanged. No explanation was necessary. The truth had been revealed, not through argument, but through action. From the tarmac, standing beside her grounded masterpiece, Evelyn Reed saw the silent exchange. She saw her pilot's life saved, her crew's lives saved, her own life saved. She followed Leo's gaze from the center of the drama to the periphery, to the shadows where the help was supposed to remain. She saw me, the janitor, the man she had tried to erase, and in that moment, I saw the certainty in her face, finally, completely, shatter. The foundation of her world, built on status and power, crumbled to dust, replaced by the irrefutable truth of a cracked piece of metal and the quiet man who had heard it whisper. 1 year later, I stood in that same hangar. Hangar 7. The air smelled the same, but my purpose was different. I was no longer in a gray janitor's uniform. I wore a crisp, dark blue polo shirt with a small embroidered logo on the chest, a stylized micrometer caliper under the words Thorn Aviation Diagnostics, my company. After the G700 incident, Inspector Chen had tracked me down through my old military records. The FAA, it turned out, had a great deal of interest in a man who could diagnose a hairline fracture from 20 yards away by sound alone. They didn't offer me a job. They offered me contracts. The most difficult, perplexing, and sensitive cases, the ones that stumped everyone else. I had built a small, elite team. We were the whisper listeners. Across the hangar, a maintenance crew was finishing a service check on a Bombardier Global 8000. Their supervisor, signing off on the logbook with a confident flourish, was Leo. He'd gotten his A&P license, acing his exams. He caught my eye and gave me that same slow, respectful nod from a year ago. I smiled and raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. He was going to be a great mechanic. He knew how to listen. Evelyn Reed never made her meeting in Zurich. The collapse of the merger she was flying to finalize triggered a catastrophic stock plunge and a shareholder revolt. The board removed her as CEO within 6 months. I read about it in a trade publication one afternoon. I felt nothing. It was just an outcome, a simple matter of cause and effect. Her certainty was her flaw, and the world had no patience for it. She had built her life on a cracked foundation. As my team packed up their gear for the day, I found myself alone for a moment beside the open hangar door. The sun was setting, painting the runway in hues of orange and gold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's micrometer. The steel was cool against my skin. I ran my thumb over the knurled adjustment knob, the numbers on the sleeve worn smooth by a lifetime of his pursuit of perfection. His voice was there, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "Listen to the metal, son. It never lies." He was right. People lie. Resumes lie. Bank accounts lie. People will judge you by the title on your business card, by the clothes you wear, by the invisible boxes they build to make the world simpler for themselves. They will try to tell you who you are. But a person's true measure is not the box they are put in. It is the standard they refuse to lower, the truth they choose to serve, especially when no one is watching. It is the quiet, unwavering integrity of a job done right. I put the tool back in my pocket, a father's legacy held close. It was time to go home. Maya had a science fair project to finish, and she needed my help. I turned my back on the world of jets and money and walked out into the evening light, just a man going home to his daughter. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been judged by your cover and found lacking, know this: your truth is your own. Hold to your standards. Do the work. Your moment is coming. Be ready for it.